Welcome back to our show, In Our Own Defense podcast. We're discussing racism and administration of justice. Dr. Tarver and I have the luxury of having our great guest here, Judge Carlos Moore, and we're going to pick back up on mental health and race in the administration of justice. Dr. Tarver.
Yeah, so before our break, Judge Moore was talking about the opioid crisis, but we also want to take some time and talk about how lawyers and judges are frequently also diagnosed with mental health concerns. Suicide, substance abuse might be a high risk for stress that could lead to depression or anxiety. And then there's also this perception that sometimes judges may want to rush and get people off their docket so they don't get overburdened and overstressed because there are a lot of cases that they have to deal with. So I wanted to just ask you, Judge, what are some of the stressors that judges may encounter that can affect your mental health?
Yeah, in Mississippi, we have something called the Lawyers and Judges Assistance Program, and it's basically for substance abuse and maybe mental health problems that we can turn to professionals for some assistance. We, as lawyers, we spend a lot of our time solving others' problems and trying to help them resolve their crises, and we neglect ourselves. And sometimes it catches up with us, and people turn to substances, whether it's alcohol or drugs, or they neglect their mental health. Some lawyers are afraid to even go be evaluated by or to talk to a psychologist or a counselor or anybody because they don't want to be labeled as crazy or whatever. But if you remember Tipper Gore, I mean, she would tell us that mental disability or mental illness is just the same as a physical illness. It just needs to be treated, and if treated appropriately, you can live a normal life. So there are resources through the Mississippi Bar and other similar bars where you can turn to professionals for assistance. And so I encourage that. It is a stressful job, and we shouldn't rush through the dockets. We should take every case, and everybody's case is very important, and we should do the best we can with each person that appears before us as a judge.
Well, about the resources that are offered, and I'm so happy to hear that they are. Now, does a person have to be willing to acknowledge they have a challenge, or as fellow attorneys or fellow judges, are you able to come to someone and say, like, hey, I'm noticing a pattern. Seems like there may be some things going on. Perhaps it may be a good idea if you go and get some support services. Is that something that happens?
We can refer ourselves, or our colleagues can refer us, or family members. You can call the director of that Lawyers and Judges Assistance Program and kind of do a confidential referral. The good thing about it, if you go through that program and successfully complete it, usually they would give you a pass on a bar complaint or a bar violation. You can keep your license because you dealt with the issue, whether or not you self-reported or you went because a colleague referred you or whatever. So it has its pluses, because if you continue on a downward spiral and do not deal with the issue, you're going to eventually lose your license or whatever, and can't practice, or you're going to be taken off the bench. So it's best to deal with it and recognize the problem and deal with it.
Yeah, because I'm sure there are some issues with the lady who I saw, the attorney who spat on that protester, and so she was arrested, but she's got a lot going on that she's going to have to go get some sort of help. I don't know if there's an ability to come back from that one, but there seems to be underlying issues, and that's a great point that the judge brought out, if I may add in there, is that, you know, these things, we don't see them because lawyers have to walk around with this pretentious air. We have to walk around like we're great, we're here, we're superheroes. But sometimes we're crumbling on the inside, and it manifests itself, like the judge said, people robbing people, robbing people, Peter to pay Paul. They're late for court, missed court, things like that. And that's when it emanates itself in that. And then you find out there is a substance abuse problem. They are under high level of stress, not getting the proper self-care. And so that is going to add that piece in there. Tarver.
And I think that's very important, because the stigma of mental health goes across the board, professional on down to people who are working blue collar jobs. And people do not want to acknowledge, one, that they need help, and two, that they're impaired to the point where it's affecting their job. I think you mentioned the word crazy, Judge, and I think a lot of times people struggle with that. That is not a psychological diagnosis, but I think layman wise, we have adopted that into our communities, where people who seek help are crazy, as opposed to these are people who are seeking help for their wellness, and we want to address that stigma. A follow-up, not necessarily regarding mental health per se, but some of the things that I think occur with judges, as we mentioned earlier, as we were having our beginning dialogue, is this notion of bias. Attorney Winters likes me to say bigotry. But oftentimes we will find that judges are engaging in judicial bias, which would just be described as their lack of self-awareness of how their personal experience and their values and their backgrounds affect how they may render certain sentencing, and particularly for officers of the law. So I just wanted to ask you, Judge, what are some of the ways that bias can be addressed in the judicial field, particularly around judges?
I believe we need more training. We have these training courses, municipal judges, we go to Biloxi, Gulfport every summer for training, but there's never any training on judicial bias. There's never any diversity training, ways to avoid bias, anything. They don't train us. They train us in the law and update us on all of the new things we should be doing as judges, but there's never any implicit bias training to avoid us doing that. And some of these judges are some of the most racist individuals in the state and in the country. Judges are humans as well, and they need to be trained. We want to train the police officers on diversity issues and sensitivity, but the judges are not getting the training. And some of these judges I have appeared before as a lawyer, the way they treat the attorneys is so bad. I mean, they treat the black attorneys one way and the white attorneys another way. And so you know they're going to treat the defendants, the black defendants, even worse than the white defendants. And so it can be pretty bad at times. I had an experience yesterday in court before a white older judge, and he treated me so very terrible. I just had to bite my tongue, and my co-counsel was a white guy, and I just sat down and let him talk, and he treated him a whole different way. But I knew if I had to say it, what was on my mind, it would not have been appropriate. So I just let the white guy get up and talk, because at that time I had enough. And if I had to say what was on my mind, and I knew it was going to be out of order, so I just let the white guy get up, and he treated him just normal. And he was my co-counsel on the same side as me, and that's unacceptable in 2020.
I mean, you have just said such a mouthful in that I'm almost kind of speechless. I know that the bias exists, but I think I'm stuck on the fact that there is absolutely no training, no anti-bias training that judges receive, no cultural competency training. None of that is required in order to serve as a judge?
I can only talk about municipal judges, and I've been on the bench 3 years since 2017 and started going to the trainings in 2018. So I've been to 2 conferences, 18 and 19. They canceled the one this year because of COVID, and there was no judicial training in regards to diversity issues or implicit bias or anything.
Yeah, maybe
you can tell
we used to set up a training session. We could charge these judges.
Well, if we talk about recommendations, as we like to do on this show, that definitely is a recommendation. You're absolutely right, Judge. You cannot require or say that you should require. I know some of the police don't receive adequate training either. You cannot require police officers to receive training that judges then don't receive. And so, yes, all that racism that's implicit in these judges, and we know that it exists. We've seen several examples of it with a judge not too long ago that made some negative statements about George Floyd and the handling of that case. So we recognize this is an issue, and the fact that there hasn't been any accountability regarding training clearly is an area that we can address. And so that is definitely a recommendation that needs to come out of this. So I think this is my last mental health question. Well, I have a couple more. And again, appreciate Attorney Winters for giving me this opportunity. So we mentioned mental health court. That's something that happens here in Georgia, but also for you, making sure that people get assessments when they may have some symptoms of mental health. But what are some of the initiatives that judges potentially can advocate for to address the overrepresentation of individuals with mental illness in our criminal justice system? Are judges involved in that process at all?
I believe there has been some legislation recently passed in Mississippi that allows certain jurisdictions, certain judges to develop mental health courts in the areas over which they preside. I believe my colleague in Greenwood that swore me in, I believe he's leading an initiative over there to start a mental health court. We don't have it in Grenada. That may be something I can look at bringing to Grenada, but it's up to each judge to push the issue in their respective realm or domain. But I think we have legislation that's been approved. So I would suggest that in states that don't have the legislation that's been approved, that they follow through with the legislation, get it approved and sign into law. And for the states that have it, that the judges take it upon themselves and go ahead and put it into motion to bring it forward in their communities, because it's definitely needed. A lot of times we are criminalizing mental health issues, and people are sitting in jail because they have a mental health issue, when that's unacceptable. If you're sick, you need to go to the doctor. Whether it's a PhD or MD, you need to go get the right counseling or the right treatment. Some people need medicine, some people need therapy, but most of these things can be treated, but if left untreated, it begins to fester and grow worse, and then you have somebody committing an even worse crime than they would have committed had they been treated.
Absolutely. And I recognize that another part of that is being able to have those mental health resources in the communities, because I recognize in a lot of areas, there aren't facilities for people to go to. So that's one of the challenges that I know that some cities face and some states face, is that outside of the inpatient psychiatric facilities, which are not places where everyone needs to go, they need to be in recovery-oriented facilities. The inpatient facilities are definitely reserved for those people that have more severe and chronic mental health, and possibly those who are forensic. But I know in a lot of areas, and this is the area here where we struggle with this, there aren't really community agencies where people can go and get those resources. So I imagine that would need to be a part of any initiatives as well, making sure that we have places where people can go when we identify that they need help.
Correct.
Yeah.
And we've been blessed in Grenada to be such a small town and community. We have a community crisis center there, and this regional is based in Grenada. And we also have Life Help for outpatient treatment. So we have 2 facilities in Grenada that we can send people to, outpatient and inpatient. So that's good. Some communities don't have that, and we probably service a lot of communities in Grenada. Sometimes with the inpatient, the beds, you have to wait on those beds, but outpatient treatment can definitely be done at Life Help for multiple people. So.
Absolutely. Well, I know we've been talking some about people who may have committed crimes, but I want to talk about their families for a second, if we can, because I recognize that sometimes when people are coming to court to support their family member who has been sentenced or is about to be sentenced or is facing some charges, that it can be a very emotional time for them, especially in some of these highly racially charged cases in which justice is not being served. What recommendations might you have to family members as they're trying to manage their emotional distress to a courtroom? I know courtrooms can be very anxiety provoking for people. But what are some of your recommendations for people that may be coming to support loved ones to court?
I would say take advantage. There's usually a victim witness coordinator in most prosecutors' office that can help the family members of those accused or maybe witnesses, help them understand the criminal justice process, help them understand what's going to go on, why it's occurring, when it's going to occur. Those professionals are good in the prosecutor's office, and they can also refer them to other community therapists or whatever if they're having problems dealing and coping with it. Because if you've had a loved one that's never been in trouble with the law, and all of a sudden they're facing several years behind bars, that's a bitter pill to swallow. And sometimes you have to have someone to get you through the grief, especially if they're convicted and you know they're going to get ready to. You see your child placed in handcuffs and hauled off to prison for several years. That's a lot to go through. So I would encourage families to seek counseling, and then support groups, other families that have gone through it. It makes it sometimes bearable when somebody knows and can empathize with you. So it could be lay people, it could be a clergy, or it could be professional mental health people.
And just as a follow-up to that, so people who may be going to court, let's say, for example, in cases like Ahmaud Arbery, where your loved one was murdered and you're going to court to see if officers will be held, or people in this particular case, these were just civilians in the community that took it upon themselves to hunt him down. How would you recommend for those families they come, knowing that that may be a situation where this person who murdered their family member may not get any true jail time, or maybe get a light sentence compared to what other people would get for similar crimes?
As lawyers for the families, if they've retained a lawyer in this instance, they have to help them through the process civilly and to advise them about the criminal justice process. We try to prepare them for any eventual outcome. There not to be an outburst in the courtroom and all that type of thing. That's easier said than done. But if you see someone get off and your child or your loved one is the one that has been killed and there's no justice, your immediate reaction is be enraged. And so you have to help them. And I would suggest in certain instances that you start preparing them mentally by getting them some professional treatment. While we are counselors at law, we're not mental health counselors. And so we can only tell them about the criminal justice system and what to expect and not to expect. But should the worst come about, I would think it's always wise, especially in these high profile cases, to have already, I don't want to say pre-spoken, but have already spoken to mental health counselors and therapists and doctors.
Thank you, Judge.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Any winners?
no problem.
Well, I want to take a quick break, Judge, because I'm going to come at you hard and fast with these questions that I have for you. And I know we know time is of the essence, but you're listening to us here on In Our Own Defense podcast. We're discussing racism in administration of justice. Dr. Dolores Tarver and I have the luxury of having Judge Carlos Moore with us to unpack this. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be right back in a moment.